Well, thanks for that very kind introduction. I'd like to tell you all that I've always been fascinated by the subject of world trade, and it was merely a matter of time before I wrote a book about the subject, but that's really not how these things occur. What actually happened was about 12 years ago, I'm sitting in my den relaxing, and I get a phone call from an acquisitions editor at Grove Atlantic Press by the name of Brando Skyhorse. I kid you not. And he tells me that they were impressed with one or two other things that I'd written in finance and economics, and they wanted me to write a history of world trade. And I said, well, I'm really not that interested in the subject. And I said, besides which, you've got the wrong Bernstein. The Bernstein you want, no relation, is a man by the name of Peter Bernstein, who was a very famous economic historian. And there followed this very awkward silence. And he said, well, we actually had lunch with him last week. And he turned us down. He's busy with another project. But he said, there's this other Bernstein you should look at. And they looked at one or two of the things that I had written and decided that I was fine for the project. And I said, well, you know, that's nice, I'll think about it. And I strode from my den into our family room where my darling wife was finishing up her morning coffee in the New York Times crossword puzzle. And I told her the story, and she put them both down, and she looked at me and she said, you know who Grove Atlantic Press is? And I said, well, not really. And she said, well, you've heard of Grove Press. And I said, well, yeah, you know, Doris Lessing and Henry Miller and other fairly well-known authors. And she said, right. And she said, and you've heard of the Atlantic Monthly. It's a famous American newspaper. And I said, yes, I'd heard of that too. She said, that's Grove Atlantic Press. If you value your career as a nonfiction writer, you will publish whatever it is they ask you to write, even if it's a cookbook. And so I thought about it for a minute, and I thought, well, a history of world trade doesn't sound very much worse than a cookbook. So I dove into the project, and as I did, I found that globalization, the globalization that we're currently experiencing, is really a very old story. And the cracks and the stresses and the strains and the dislocations of it are centuries old. And in fact, the changes that were wrought in the 16th century through the 19th century are very much more wrenching, and were very much more wrenching than those that we're experiencing today. So if we want to understand what's going on today, it really helps to understand what went on in the past. And there's two basic themes of this talk. One is because of the improvements in technology, which we're going to hear more about from the following speaker. Transport costs have fallen. Sea transport, maritime transport, has always had an advantage over land transport, and that advantage has grown and shrunk throughout time and affected the shape of world trade. The other thing is that with falling transport costs, you see new trade patterns, and with new trade patterns, there are winners and there are losers. There are people who come out ahead and people who come out behind, and the people who come out behind are always going to try and throw sand into the gears. So rather than be very didactic about this, and certainly I'm not going to read from my book, I'm going to just tell you two very fast vignettes that illustrate the process. The first begins in the year 1635, when the Spanish barbers of Mexico City, that is to say the surgeons, the bloodletters of Mexico City, complained to the viceroy about the presence of Chinese bloodletters in the city. This is basically 4 centuries ago, unfair competition from Asian labor. And the viceroy referred the matter to the city council, who recommended back to the viceroy that the Chinese barbers be banished to the outskirts of the city, and that their numbers be limited to 12. Now, exactly what the viceroy did has been lost to history. The second story actually begins in the modern world in the year 1931, when an 11-year-old boy is walking along the beach north of Perth in Western Australia, and he comes across a couple of dozen large, very old silver coins, and he shows them to his parents, who take it to the local curator of the local museum, and they realize that these are Spanish 8 real pieces, Austrian thalers, and people very quickly realize there's a shipwreck, a treasure ship that's sunk offshore, and they begin to look frantically for it. And they don't find anything until 30 years later, when some skin divers, some spear fishermen, quite by accident, come across the wreck in shallow waters of a ship called the Vergulde Drek, which was a Dutch East Indiaman, the Golden Dragon, was the English translation, that had left Amsterdam in the year 1655. So, hearing these two very quick vignettes, you might ask yourself, how did Chinese barbers find their way to Mexico City in the year 1635? How did a Dutch East Indiaman find its way off the coast of Western Australia, more or less the same time, a full century before Sir Captain James Cook discovered Australia? And if we're going to understand these two stories, we have to understand what global trade looked like 400 years ago. And it's really the story of 3 long-distance luxury commodities. In the English language, at least, they all begin with the letter S. They're easy to remember. They are spices and silk and silver. It's difficult for people today to realize just what a firm grasp spices had on the imagination of the average European during the early and middle medieval periods. We're talking really about 4 spices. We're talking about nutmeg and mace, which come from the same fruit. We're talking about cloves, and we're talking about cinnamon. And these were the Armani suit and the BMW and the Gucci shoe of their era. They were the luxury good, the status symbol, par excellence. And not only were they very desirable luxury goods, but they were wrapped in mystery because no one knew where they came from. They came from the Spice Islands, which tells you that no one knew anything about them aside from the fact that spices grew there. In fact, they grew, the first 3 of them grew in the eastern Indonesian archipelago just off the coast of New Guinea, and cinnamon came from Sri Lanka, all of which were well below the geographical horizon of European knowledge. When you went into someone's home in that era, certainly before the year 1500, and you smelled these spices, this announced to you, here dwells someone of wealth and power. When you visit today the grandness of and the glories of Venice, you are seeing the riches that spice created. In fact, those riches were only a very small part of the wealth that was created by the spice trade, the part that was controlled by Europeans, which was only the last 5% of the supply chain, which began in Alexandria or on the wharves of Cairo. And people began to realize that whoever could control this trade from its source would become immensely wealthy and powerful. Diaz and Columbus and da Gama and Magellan and de Broglie weren't looking for new worlds to discover. In fact, da Gama knew exactly where he was going. He was going to Calicut on the Malabar coast of India. They weren't looking for souls to save because Lord knows they'd wasted more souls than they saved. They weren't even looking for gold. They were looking for spices. Now, the second luxury commodity of the era was silk. Silk was discovered 5,000 years ago by the Chinese, and it remained a Chinese monopoly for 3,000 years until the dawn of the Common Era, when its secret leaked out to Japan, and then 500 years later when the Emperor Justinian commissioned a couple of industrial spies to go to China and smuggle home the silkworm. And all you have to know about silk was that the further away you got in that supply chain from China, the lower the quality of the silk. So no self-respecting Tokugawa aristocrat wanted Japanese silk, the local product. He wanted Chinese silk. Persian silk, Indian silk, not of such high quality. European silk of even lower quality. And the lowest quality silk of all came from Mexico, all right, where it had been transported or transplanted by the Spaniards. Now, usually at this point in the talk, when I'm giving it and people are asking questions, I get asked, well, aren't you going to talk about the Silk Road? Because isn't this how silk got from Asia to Europe? And most of the time it didn't. Most of the time it rose on the monsoon winds for two very good reasons, all right? Number one, because, as I've already said, sea transport is generally an order of magnitude more important than land transport, although the land transport that the Asians had was probably the most advanced transport of its era during the medieval period, which was the F1 hybrid camel, which was a cross, a first generation cross between a Bactrian and a dromedary camel. A single driver could lead 3 or 4 tons of cargo 30 miles in a day, which was better than anything that the Europeans had. But in order for the supply chain to work, you needed political stability throughout the Eurasian continent. And that only occurred at 2 points in ancient history or remote history. One was during the joint ascendancy of the Han Empire and the Roman Empire around the dawn of the Common Era, lasted for a couple of centuries. And the second time occurred during the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol ascendancy during the 12th and 13th century, when the Polo brothers and Ibn Battuta made their famous trips. The rest of the time, there wasn't enough political stability, and almost all goods went from Asia to Europe through the Indian Ocean by sea. So the next question is, what did the Europeans have to trade with the Asians for these goods? And the answer was precious little. The primary manufactured product of Europe at that time was wool, which does not go over terribly well in a tropical climate. In fact, the Europeans really only had one thing that the Asians wanted, and in fact still want, which is silver. And the problem was they didn't have very much of it in the year 1510, 1515, when the first Portuguese arrived in the Spice Islands, because all of the old Roman mines had been long since played out. That changes very dramatically around the year 1550, when vast quantities of silver are discovered in the New World. In the great mine of Potosi, the silver mine in Peru, and in Guanajuato in western Mexico, with ground-level deposits. The Spaniards and the mints in Mexico City and in Lima produced something like 2 billion pieces de 8 reales. So this is about a 40-grain coin or 40-gram coin of silver. It was cut into 8 pieces, 8 1 real pieces, hence the American slang expression 2 bits for $0.25. And this was the $100 bill and the Discover card, the MasterCard, the American Express card of its era. It was universally recognized around the world, and it was legal tender in multiple countries around the world, including the United States, until the year 1857. So what you have now is a system in which there are a vast amount of trade goods just waiting to get around the world. How did they get there? Well, they went there on the trade winds, which, as most of you know, are 2 paired systems. There is a pair of equatorial systems above and below the equator, which runs from east to west. It's how Magellan got around the world. It's how Columbus got from the Canary Islands to the Caribbean inside of just 6 weeks. And there's a high latitude system at 45 degrees north and south latitude. And so what the Spaniards would do is they would ship these vast amounts of silver on treasure ships on the southern low latitude system, and then ship the silks and the spices on the the northern system. You could sail a ship from Manila up past Japan, across the Pacific Ocean, and down to Acapulco inside of about 4 months, which was quite a navigational feat at the time. And this produces an enormous amount of wealth. And the winners in this system were the Manolianos. Who were the Manolianos? The Manolianos were Spaniards who lived in Manila and who realized the potential for this trade and established warehouses in Acapulco and in Mexico City and in Peru. They were the first movers, and they made fabulous amounts of money. Who were the losers? Well, the losers, we've already come up with one of them, which were the Spanish barbers, and I'll get to that in a minute. The other losers, of course, were the silk growers of Mexico, who suddenly found themselves flooded with a very low-cost, very high-quality product. Okay, so this is Renault's getting replaced by Toyotas in 1970. And they lost an enormous amount of market share. What do the losers do in this situation? They call for protection, okay? Just like the barbers did, and just like future people would call for in the future. So now we understand, with a little bit of imagination, how the Chinese barbers got to Mexico City. These were the grandchildren and great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren of the first servants, the Chinese servants, who the Manolianos were partial to, they would bring them over when they established their warehouses and their shops in Mexico City. I've also mentioned that there's a high-latitude system that blows in the southern hemisphere. Well, this was how goods basically got from Europe to Asia, the usual journey around the Cape of Good Hope, and then rounding and heading straight for Batavia or the Spice Islands on an northeasterly course was deadly. Half the men would die. Dutchmen usually didn't sail with the East India Company, the Dutch East India Company. You couldn't get Dutchmen to do it because it was too dangerous. So they got Germans to do it. And these were the people who generally crewed VOC, that is, Dutch East India Company ships. And so a Dutch sea captain by the name of Brouwer discovers that if when rounding the Cape of Good Hope you head southeast, you catch these trade winds, which are really going, because there's no land down there, almost no land down there to stop them, just the southern cone at 50 degrees south latitude of South America and also the South Island of New Zealand. And you could make the trip from Amsterdam to Batavia in 6 months. Very, very impressive. There was only one problem, which is you had to know when to turn left. All right, and go north and thread the Sunda Strait. Because if you didn't do it at just the right time, you went splat into the west coast of Australia. And there were literally dozens of East India Company ships of both countries, Holland and the UK and of England, that shipwrecked. And some of these shipwrecks were lurid and spectacular, with mutinies and civil wars among the strand crew members and passengers, cannibalism. And the Dutch East India Company, when this usually happened, would send out rescue crews. Now, the rescue crews weren't there to rescue the people. They were there to rescue the silver chests. And most of the time, they recovered them. But when the Virgule de Drech shipwrecked, they never found the ship until a small boy, 300 years later, is walking along the beach and comes across some coins from the wreck. So I'm going to now fast forward through 2 centuries or 3 centuries of trade history. And what basically happens is that most medieval economic historians who've studied medieval history think that there was about an order of magnitude difference in the efficiency of sea versus land transport. But what happens over the next 300 years is maritime technology rapidly outstrips landborne technology. The sailing ship of the year 1830 was a technological marvel compared to the round ships of 300 years before, whereas the road wagon of the year 1800 wasn't very much different from the road wagon of the year 1500. And so this margin of advantage that sea transport has over land transport now goes from about 10 to 1 to about 40 to 1, all right? And what does this mean? Well, it means several different things. If you're going to transport grain, you can't do it over a very long distance because of the inefficiency, over land at least. And what it means is that if there's a region that has a short crop, there's a famine, and people starve because it's just too expensive to bring grain in from surrounding areas in many cases. Now, the news wasn't all bad. If you were a farmer and you had adequate grain reserves, the prices in your area would go up because grain couldn't be shipped in. So famine sometimes was the farmer's friend. But it meant something far more important than that, which is that by the middle of the 19th century, there are coming onto the world markets the potential for vast new supplies of grain outside of Europe. North America, in the Midwest in particular, South America on the Pampas, Australia, New Zealand, and even in the Ukraine. And the problem was that if you were a farmer in any of these areas and you had a farm more than 30 or 50 kilometers from the nearest river port or seaport, you might as well have been located on the backside of the moon. Now, you would have thought that the invention of the first railways by Stephenson and Trethwick in the very early part of the 19th century would have solved the problem. But they did not, because the rails were made of iron. And iron wore out very quickly. Generally, the rails had to be replaced once per year. They couldn't bear very much weight, certainly not the weight of tons and tons of grain. What was needed was steel. Now, humans had produced steel for thousands of years, but unfortunately not in bulk. Steel is almost a byproduct, if you will, of the old smelting process of iron. So high-quality steel was very expensive, in the range of about 1,000 English pounds of that day per ton. This changes very dramatically in the year 1855 when Henry Bessemer invents a blast process for producing steel. And all of a sudden, the price of steel falls from 1,000 pounds per ton to 10 pounds per ton. And you have available cheap steel, 95% of which initially goes into the production of rails for railroads, all right? And the other few percent of it goes into the production of boilers, which are of much higher quality than iron boilers. And all of a sudden, this vast agricultural potential of the New World and of Australia and of the Ukraine comes onto the European markets, and European farmers didn't know what hit them. Not only are they being buried in grain, but their markets were open, because this was the first flourishing of free trade ideology in the world. Men like Richard Cobden and his acolyte, Louis Napoleon, who inked with England the Cobden-Chevalier Treaty, which was the world's first great free trade agreement. And different countries reacted in different ways. The ones who reacted the worst were, of course, the French and the Germans, who their farmers sought and got protection because they were such a political force. The most interesting response was the response of the Danes. The Danes, being Scandinavians, reacted more intelligently than their more southern brethren, and they formed themselves into cooperatives, as Danes are wont to do, and they realized they could feed their cows and their pigs with all of this cheap grain. So they not only ramp up butter production, but they also brand it. The Lurpak brand you'll see in supermarkets, same Lurpak brand you'll see in supermarkets around the world. By the year 1900, 50% of the world's bacon production came from Denmark. The American response was interesting. The United States had pretty much always been a protectionist country. The country was fairly evenly divided between a free trading South, which produced agricultural products, and a northern industrial base, which was very protectionist because it couldn't compete with the leading edge British technology of the era. But that ended with that balance, if you will, ended with the loss of the Civil War by the South. And after 1865, the United States was solidly a protectionist country. And so you had a HowlRound, this spiral, this death spiral of tariffs, retaliatory tariffs, which ran around for something like 60 or 70 years, culminating in the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930, which pretty much shut down world trade. And this was a very dangerous thing to do. There's a French economist by the name of Frederick Bastiat, who very famously said, "When goods are not allowed to cross borders, soldiers will." And what happened, particularly in the case of Germany, is that it couldn't repay its reparations that it was due under the Versailles Treaty, which increased their frustration only more, which led in no small part to World War II. And the people in foreign ministries and state departments around the world knew this. Cordell Hull, the American Secretary of State before World War II, desperately tried to unwind these tariffs with only partial success. He did it too late. And in the ashes of World War II, an American Undersecretary of State by the name of William Lawton writes probably the most important document that no one has ever heard of, called the Proposals for the Expansion of Trade and Employment, which led to something that everyone here knows about, which is the GATT, the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade. So clearly, by the end of the 17th century, and certainly the end of the 19th century, all of the elements of today's globalization were in place. A global market in the most strategic commodities, a highly mobile international workforce, an international monetary system, and discontents aplenty, not just the barbers that I talked about and the silk growers, but also English weavers who were discomfited by cotton and calico imports, European farmers, sugar growers in Madeira who were having much cheaper Brazilian sugar dumped on their shores on their way from Brazil back to Portugal. And the list goes on and on. In the course of writing the book, I came across innumerable stories with a modern resonance. And all you had to do, in many cases, is to modernize the grammar, change a couple of the proper nouns, and you're reading about the most recent controversies about Brexit or TTP or TTIP or whatever. Now, you'll remember at the beginning of the talk, I warned you that the story that I was about to tell was about falling transport costs, the ratio of land transport to sea transport, and also about winners and losers. And the news here for this audience, I think, is good, because the ratio that went from 10 to 1 in the ancient period to 40 to 1 in the early 19th century and back to 10 to 1 with modern steam technology running on steel and then on the internal combustion engine has probably narrowed even further, down to perhaps half an order of magnitude. And so the possibility exists, as was mentioned by the Minister for Transport, for the first time, of a new land route following the old Silk Road route. Now remember, I also told you that the Silk Road route was fraught with political difficulties. You think about the countries that have to be traversed: China, Kazakhstan, Russia. Relationships among these countries aren't simple, and in fact the One Belt, One Road initiative, to my understanding, focuses on a southern route at present, because that's what the Chinese seem to want to commit to. Now that obviously could change. The bigger issue that faces the world today has to do with how to treat the winners and the losers. There's a very famous quote from a paper by Paul Samuelson and Wolfgang Stolper, two very famous economists. And I've translated it from economese into English, but these are pretty much their words. The harm which free trade inflicts upon some people is necessarily less than the gain to society as a whole. In other words, free trade does have winners and losers, but it also benefits society as a whole more. Hence, it is always possible to bribe those harmed by subsidy or other redistributive devices so as to leave everyone better off as the result of trade. In other words, free trade is so beneficial that you ought to be able to take some of its profits and neutralize the losers, buy them off, compensate them, all right? And that means a couple of different things. It means, first of all, that there's a correlation in the world that we see today between the degree of trade that forms a nation's economy and the strength of their social safety network. So the more your economy depends on trade, the more of a safety net you need. Holland is the classic example of that. Scandinavian countries are other good examples of that as well. At the other end of the spectrum, sadly, is my home country, the United States, which has only 20% of its economy hinging on foreign trade, and also has the developed world's weakest social safety network. So the second thing, and this is a more dark note, which is that the Stolper-Samuelson perspective that the gains from free trade outweigh its detrimental effects on certain groups and that you can always compensate them is starting to fall into question. Samuelson, late in his life, started to question it. Paul Krugman, another very famous advocate of free trade, has lately started to wonder about it as well. Why? Well, what it turns out is the empirical data show that as tariff rates fall, the incremental benefits to free trade also fall. But the redistribution costs as your facilities move, say, from a textile plant from the northern United States to the southern United States to Mexico to Malaysia, then to Vietnam, and finally to Cambodia, occurs so rapidly that the redistribution costs of retraining people and giving people unemployment benefits dramatically increases. And we may be well past the point of diminishing returns. I'm going to finish with a way of thinking about this problem. And it's a rhetorical device called the trilemma. And the trilemma is a rhetorical device that says that you have three desirable quantities, all right, and you can only have two of them at any one time, all right? The classic example of this is the Fleming-Mundell trilemma of international monetary policy. So, for example, you can have control of your monetary supply and you can have fixed exchange rates, but then you have to give up free capital flow. And this is what the Chinese have done, all right? They have severe capital restrictions. You can have control of your monetary supply, and you can have free international capital flows, but then you have to let your currency float. All right, and that's what the United States and most of the world's developed nations outside of Europe have done. What you Europeans have done within your own world is you've taken the bottom two ones. You've got a fixed exchange rate, that is to say you've got a single currency, okay? You've got free international capital flows, but you've given up control of your monetary supply, as people in the Baltics know all too well when they adopted the euro. There's one exception, I should say, which is you can have all three if you're German, all right? But that's another story. Now, there's one that I mentioned. It has nothing to do with this talk, but it's so cute I can't resist putting it. This is one from Slavoj Žižek. I think I pronounced his name correctly, which goes between being a communist, being honest, and being intelligent. So, for example, you can be an intelligent communist, but then you can't be honest. Okay? You can be intelligent and honest, but then you can't be a communist. Okay? And finally, you can be an honest communist, but then you're not very smart. All right? So, more seriously, this is the final trilemma, and this is the one I want to end with. Danny Roderick is a Turkish academic who works at Harvard University, I believe at the Kennedy School. And he postulates that you can have three things. You can have hyperglobalization, by which he also includes, I see I didn't take out the spell check from my slide thing here, by which he means not only free flow of goods, but free flow of capital. You can have a unitary nation state that has strong national sovereignty, and you can have democracy. And you can have two of them, but you can't have three. So this represents, if you will, the remote past, the more recent past, and perhaps the future. And we'll talk about the present in just a minute. So the old days, the good old days of the VOC and the EIC, the East India Companies of Holland and of England, they had hyperglobalization, they had free flow of capital, they had free flow of goods, they certainly were supported by a strong nation state, but the losers that they produced had to be suppressed. These were not very democratic organizations, all right? So they chucked democracy. The world of the gold standard worked pretty much the same way as well. You can't have a gold standard in a democratic world. It just doesn't work. Then there's the more recent past, which is the Bretton Woods Consensus, which ran from 1944 to 1971, in which you had strong nation states, you had people had decided democracy was a good idea, but you had severe capital controls. If you were a Brit, if you were a French person, you couldn't take anything out of the country in terms of currency, all right? You know, French people had to have this humiliating little carnet, this little book they carried around. And then, what are we looking at today? Well, today, everybody has decided they want democracy. But we're oscillating between chucking hyperglobalization or chucking the nation state. So Europeans seem to be, except maybe the Brits, seem to be leaning towards keeping the nation, towards keeping globalization, at least within Europe, and chucking national sovereignty. The Americans seem more to be moving, to my way of thinking, in the direction of the nation state. Well, finally, there's the remote future, which is you can have hyperglobalization, you can have democracy, but that democracy has to be a world democracy. You need world government. And that's not something that you or I or our children or our grandchildren are going to see, but I think that that is the way that history is moving over the next 500 or 1,000 years, but that's my own opinion. So with that happy note, I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, William. And one short question from human perspective. When I was coming to this conference, I was looking for the number for simple taxi, and it dropped out for me on the web page, kind of Taxify, which is kind of Uber only in Latvian roots. And the question is how those new services, which we could not prognose, because service like Uber, which is breaking down the typical transport system or typical service like taxis, it was not quite prognosable. Is this something like that going into the picture you represent to us here? And is something like that, do you feel as a future knower from this perspective, that something like this is coming to the railroad business too?
Well, the railroads are an interesting model, which I don't think applies to the Uber model. I mean, Europeans are intelligent enough to know that a good rail system is built and designed by the state and run by private enterprise, okay, as opposed to like our interstate highway system in the United States and most highway systems. In the United States, by the way, we do railroads exactly wrong, okay? They're owned by the private companies